Hello, I'm artist Wanaree Tanner. Today I'll be demonstrating how to create a finely detailed, complex geometric hollow form bead using my signature tool line. First, we'll cover how to create the metal clay geoform utilizing my hollow form system. I developed this process to eliminate the otherwise tedious dry construction methods of the past. You'll be able to create complex, geometric structures out of metal clay without ever needing to dry sand. There are a number of different shapes and sizes, but the basic method is the same for all of them. This process is effective on other varieties of metal clay, so long as the working properties of the clay are similar to the fine silver clay featured here. If you're new to metal clay, clay consistency and texture are critical with my tools and methods. You want to select a high-quality metal clay that is flexible when semi-dry, has a long working time, and is really strong and firm when completely dry. I recommend PMC Flex Fine Silver or Art Clay Fine Silver, the current formula. Let's get started. Each hollow form kit comes with 2 burnout forms and a plastic forming stencil. We'll use the stencil to cut and shape the clay around the burnout form. The stencil is inside the white envelope. Go ahead and take that out. Feel the surface of the stencil. One side is scored and the other is not. You want to make sure the score side is facing out toward you. These scores should never touch the clay surface. You'll need to prep the stencil by creasing along the score edges, opening and closing each tab and side a few times. This reusable stencil is heat resistant up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Notice the color-coded tabs. We'll address those later. Flatten the stencil out and it's ready to use. To keep the forming stencil in its final shape, we'll need a couple pieces of clear tape, 2 to 3 inches long, with one side dog-eared so it's easy to remove. Go ahead and prepare both pieces and leave it attached to your work surface. Here I've got it on a ceramic tile. Then we'll prep a rolling folder. You'll need to eco-grease the rolling folder to prevent the clay from bunching up inside the folder as it's slabbed out. The grease will last through multiple uses. Just reapply a small amount as needed and spread inside the rolling folder with your fingertips. The hollow form stencil and burnout form have been calibrated to fit exactly a 3-card thick slab. You'll either want to use 3 playing cards or you can use slats, or in this case I'm using a rolling frame. I've taken out about 15 grams of clay. If your clay is fresh, knead it until it no longer sticks to your fingers. This geoform will use less than 7 grams of clay after cutting and shaping to size. Place the clay inside the rolling folder and roll out from the center. You'll need to release the slab occasionally from each side of the rolling folder. If you don't, the clay can become bunched up inside the folder. It's critical to have a nice even slab, so periodically flip and release each side of the slab from the folder and continue rolling out. Release the clay slab from each side of the folder a final time, and then place the stencil with the score side facing toward you, making sure you can feel the score marks. Close the folder, then roll the stencil and slab together to 3 cards thick. This attaches the clay to the forming stencil. Keep in mind we do want to keep this process moving. We don't want the clay to dry out too much. Take your needle tool and just gently drag it along the edges of the stencil. Don't bear down, just lightly pull it against the stencil so you don't cut into the rolling folder. Remove the excess clay and put it back into its packaging. Grab your tape and work surface. Pick up the entire rolling folder and flip it over onto your hand. Carefully peel the plastic away from the wet clay at an extreme angle, releasing any clay that peels up with it. Crease the clay along each fold. Next, we'll need to cut the clay away from the green and red tabs. These tabs will remain outside of the geoform and along with the tape will hold the stencil edges together. Press a stiff, straight blade carefully lined up to each tab crease, then use your thumb as counter pressure against the blade. You'll feel the blade hit the stencil. Go ahead and scrape the clay right off that tab. For these inside tabs, think over-under the clay slab, then over the stencil to help you line up the blade to the tab crease. It's important to get these cuts right on the tab creases. Overcutting will leave large gaps along the seam. You can just push the clay slightly to meet the edge as needed. Also, be mindful of undercutting. The clay can jam up the form when you go to close it. Finish cutting the clay off from all the green and red tabs and return the clay scraps back to the packaging. If available, use pastemaker to join the seams. Pastemaker works great alone and doesn't require any metal clay to be mixed in with it to be effective. You can also substitute with a very loose paste of water mixed with fresh clay. Have a burnout form ready. Take a foam tool and spread a liberal amount of liquid along each edge. To assemble, begin with the side that has 2 green tabs and 1 red tab. The red tabs are indicators of where you should first attach each piece of tape. Start forming the clay and stencil, lining the sides tightly together, leaving the color-coded tabs outside of the form. Line the edges up and fold the red tab over that corner. Push together the corners and press the tape in place to hold the tab in position with the dog-eared end hanging off to the side. Check that the tab is flush along the corner edge. Drop in a burnout form. Check that the tape is secure on that first join. Now weave the other side under the green tab, making sure it doesn't get caught under the clay, as this will distort the shape significantly. Take the second piece of tape and position it on the second red tab, again leaving the dog-eared side hanging long. Bring it together and then wrap the tape over each green tab, pressing the corners and seams tightly together. Burnish the tabs flush against the sides, wrapping the tape around the form to cover each green tab as needed. Look over the entire form, checking to make sure the tabs are flush and the corners are tight. The forming shell and tape tend to hold moisture in, so you do want to heat dry the entire form. You can either use a dehydrator set on high, or you can place the hollow form on an electric candle warmer like this one for 20 minutes. These types of dryers dry out the forms much faster, but be careful when using something like a griddle to dry out your piece. The forming stencil is heat resistant up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, so you want to make sure the temperature is below that. Most candle warmers remain well below that temperature, and most dehydrators never get quite that hot. After 20 minutes, you can see condensation has begun to develop on a few of the sides. The clay is semi-dry and now partially free of the forming shell. We'll need to remove the tape and crack open a couple of tabs slightly to allow the moisture to further escape. Carefully peel the tape off, but make sure to brace each seam with your other hand as you're peeling the tape open. Remove the tape and place the entire form back on the warmer and allow to dry for another 10 to 20 minutes. After drying, you'll see condensation building up within the forming shell, in between the plastic and the metal clay. The forming shell should release easily. If it doesn't, return it to the dryer for another 10 minutes. Here you can see the clay now holds the complex geometric shape. Look over the dry metal clay geoform. Here you can see a small gap in the seam. To repair, mix a really thick paste, the thicker the better, and use that to build the corner up. Wipe the paste with a flat tool along one side of the geoform, building up the corner from that edge. Keep the flat face flush to whichever surface you're working on. The clean edge will return when repeating this process on the adjacent side. I can't emphasize this enough. Do not tilt the tool face. Keep it flush to the surface. Otherwise, you'll end up with a dull or uneven edge. Don't worry about getting the surface completely smooth, just focus on rebuilding the seam for now, then heat dry for 5 to 10 more minutes. Now for refinement, we'll be using my wet refinement process instead of dry sanding. We'll need a foam tool and a little bit of water to reshape the dried clay surface. The light coat of water along with the motion of the foam moves excess clay material into gaps and dents instead of just removing clay from the surface of the piece the way dry sanding does. Spread a small amount of water on the target surface, then flip over to the dry, broad, flat side of the foam tool. Work in tiny circles and smoothing sweeps alternating between wet and dry. Think of it as more damp than wet. Always work the broad face of the foam tool flush against the surface you're refining. The clay begins to smooth out as the dry foam tool pulls against that moistened surface. Don't drench it in water. Wipe off the foam as you work to prevent clay or water from building up. Again, keep both surfaces flush together and the edges will sharpen on their own as you work each adjacent side. Once refined, return to the dryer for another 10 to 15 minutes. Now, if this is as far as you want to go and you're ready to fire this form, you do want to make sure to drill a small hole to allow the smoke to escape from that burnout form. After firing, you can then come back and fill with a really thick paste, refire, and then sand it smooth. Now we're ready to turn that geoform into an ornamental bead. First, I'll demonstrate how to use my signature die-cut tools to create finely detailed elements that you can cut, stack, and combine in countless ways. The magnetic die-cut heads are interchangeable. They both impress and cut metal clay into consistent dimensional elements when used against a small glazed ceramic tile. I personally designed and hand-finished the bronze die-cut tool to the micromillimeter to capture unparalleled depth and detail. This is the granular daisy die head. We'll want to cut out 8 of these. Each tool face is calibrated to a specific playing card thickness. Refer to the label for best results. First, lightly grease your rolling folder. Just a few quick swipes of eco grease. Don't over-apply. When you first open a pack of clay, it's likely to be quite wet, especially if it's a flexible formula. Knead in between your fingers until the clay stops sticking. If you're using a flex formula, you may need to work it a little bit longer as the glycerin that's mixed in prevents the clay from drying out. Clay consistency is critical with this process. Too wet and the clay will stick to the die-cut face. Too dry and it won't stick to the ceramic tile. There's an ideal working window, which you'll find with a little bit of practice. Don't try to die-cut large sheets of clay, it will just dry out. Cut small, long strips so the excess clay is easy to remove from between the clay elements, while the consistency is still ideal. Roll out your clay inside the rolling folder, then use the folder to flip the clay directly onto the tile. Generally, I avoid picking up the clay with my fingertips whenever I can. Every time you pick it up, you're distorting and stretching that slab out. Pull the rolling folder off of the clay slab. Brush some dry release directly onto the clay. You want to actually see the powder sitting on the surface. If the clay sticks to the die, you probably need to use more dry release. Press the die head into the clay, working the head in tiny wiggling circles against the tile. This motion will force the clay further into the die face and separate it from the surrounding clay. Leave at least 5 millimeters between each element to prevent distorting its neighbor. Work your straight blade under the longest edge. If it's still too sticky, give it a few moments to dry out, then peel it away from the elements. Now the edges look a little bit rough, but don't worry as these super thin pieces will flake right off the elements after drying. We'll also need to die cut 5 star seed elements. Repeat the same process. Slab down the clay, transfer onto the tile, dust with dry release, die cut the clay, and then remove the excess. Then we'll repeat this process again with the focal elements. The 5-petal bloom, 10-petal bloom, and small leaf. Remember, you have 8 bead faces to decorate, so you'll need 8 of each. Slab down, transfer, dry release, cut and remove the excess. By now your clay is likely drying out too much. Take it and dip it in a little bit of water and knead it until the clay no longer sticks to your fingers, then return it back to the packaging. The clay consistency is perfect when the clay doesn't stick to your fingers, but it still has a little bit of a bounce or a sponginess to it. You don't want it to be too dry and hard. This tile is pretty full, so we can go ahead and set it to dry. You can air dry for 10 to 20 minutes or heat dry for no more than 5 minutes. Now we'll use the calibrated cutters to transform the die-cut elements and create granulation. Attach a piece of tape, sticky side up, onto your work surface. This will help keep the granules organized. Once the elements are dried, we are ready to cut apart our granules with the calibrated cutters. The dull side is painted red for your reference. They are sharpened on one side to cut the dry elements as well as wet clay. There are 8 cutters ranging from 1.5 mm to 6 mm with a sizing reference guide included. Use the sizing guide to find the 2.5 mm cutter, leaving the next size smaller cutter inside to act as a plunger. Take your granular daisy and fit the cutter around one granule and rock it back and forth to cut it apart from the element. It will become trapped inside the cutter. Plunge it out onto the sticky side of the tape. This keeps the granules the right side up and organized. Continue until you've cut apart all the granular daisy elements. Repeat with the star seed element, cutting apart the granulation, this time with a 2 mm cutter. Complete this process for all the elements. Along with the granulation, we're going to refine those focal elements. Use a needle tool to scrape along the edges of the elements. The excess clay will flake right off. Now find the 2.5 mm calibrated cutter. We're stacking the 10-petal bloom onto the 5-petal bloom element, but first we'll need to remove the center granule from the 5-petal bloom so the 10-petal will sit evenly on top. Use the cutter to remove the center and the blooms will stack nicely. Now before attaching elements, it's a good idea to draw a centering line to keep all those elements evenly spaced. Use a pencil and ruler to mark the center of each panel. I use pastemaker liquid if available, or you can mix a really loose paste with a little bit of water and fresh clay. Pick up the element with a pair of curved nose tweezers and wet just the back side of it. Avoid getting the detail face wet, as this can distort the design. Move into position. I really recommend this Princeton Mini Detailer Angle Shader Brush. It features bristles perfectly sized for the scale and a short coated rubber handle that I use to roll over the elements to seal the connections. Use the bristle end to clean up around each element seam. Draw the back of the 10-petal bloom through pastemaker and lay it on top of the 5-petal bloom. Use the handle to roll it over the element. You can clean the roughness on each element edge with the water-dampened brush. Don't over-wet. Really think more damp than wet when you're working with these. You'll attach the granules with the same method. For the center of the bloom, we'll use one of the 2 mm granules from the granular starseed die. Press it into position. Use the brush to seal the join seams between the elements. Always brush in one direction when joining seams. Brushing both ways opens and closes the join. Place additional 2 mm granules in each of the petals of the 5-petal bloom. And brush around each granule to secure the join. Then add the 2.5 mm and 2 mm granulation around the 3 available bloom edges. Place the 2 mm granule between the 2.5 mm granules. Then attach the small leaf element above the bloom, again dragging the backside through pastemaker and pressing it into position. Brush the seam edges around each element to further fuse the join. Add 2 more 2 mm granules above the small leaf element to finish the edge of the bead. Then wet wash all the details with a water-damp brush to further fuse the granules and the elements together. You want to blend the seams away, brushing in one direction, closing and checking for gaps. Wet wash the element seams, being careful not to overwet or smash the fine surface detailing. Allow to dry, then repeat this pattern on the remaining bead faces. After completing the design, double-check that all the element seams are completely fused. Here you can see a small separation remains. Wet inside the seam with pastemaker or loose paste and press the opening closed with the brush handle. Clean the seam join as needed with the brush. Now we're ready to cut the bead open. Apply a wash of pastemaker to the bead tip. It will soak in and help soften the clay. You can use water instead of pastemaker for this step. While it doesn't soak into those drier layers of clay the way pastemaker does, it will help you lay in a nice cut line. Press your straight blade along each edge. Try not to force it through. Just follow the granulation around the bead tip, rocking slightly until it just slices off. To widen the bead hole, find the center with the needle tool and work the opening wider. Worry the needle slightly. Then use a round metal file to sand the opening wider. Finally, go over the entire bead face with a lightly dampened foam tool to smooth out any roughness and remove any clay debris. Again, be careful not to overwet the surface of that element. Think more damp than wet. After refinement, set the bead to dry completely on a heated dryer for 10 to 20 minutes, and the bead is ready to fire. I recommend firing these pieces nestled in alumina hydrate inside a small firing dish. Be careful of alumina hydrate. You don't want to aspirate the powder. Wear a mask whenever you're pouring or brushing it off. Make sure to set the bead into the alumina hydrate with the corners facing down. The strength is in the corners. The flat edges can dent in from the weight of the clay during firing, while the corners are really supported. Whichever hollow form shape you select, always remember, fire with the corner edge down and leave the bead holes exposed to allow the smoke from the burnout form to escape. For firing, I recommend kiln firing. You can either follow the manufacturer's directions for firing temperatures and time, or generally I recommend full ramping up to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit and holding it at that temperature for 30 minutes to an hour. Now this burnout form does create smoke as it heats up, so you'll want to vent your kiln. Either crack the door open half an inch or remove the kiln plug. Once the kiln reaches 1000 degrees Fahrenheit, you can go ahead and close the door or replace the plug. Allow it to fire completely and then cool down to room temperature before removing the firing container. Alumina hydrate can discolor during firing and discolor the surface of the silver, but it brushes off or you can wash it off as well. Again, remember to wear a mask if you're brushing off the alumina hydrate. Now for patina, you can use liver of sulfur mixed with steaming hot water, or here I prefer to use black max. You either want to hold your piece with tweezers or wear gloves. Black max is composed of an acid that can irritate your skin. Dip a Q-tip into the black max and work it over the entire silver surface. I like to patina directly onto the white fire scale while the surface pores are still open in the silver. The patina takes immediately. Make sure to thoroughly rinse off with water, removing any residual black max. Now for finishing, I really love and recommend these Dremel 120 grit abrasive detail brushes. They have really heavy bristles that literally wipe away inconsistencies and roughness. Screw onto a mandrel and use a handheld rotary tool. Here I'm using my Fordham micromotor tool. Turn it on, then work the brush in tiny circles to erase away any dings or dents. Focus on each panel one little section at a time, really working the exposed edges. We'll kind of speed up this process to give you an idea of how much the metal surface transforms with a little time and attention. If you notice, I'm always moving the brush in tiny counterclockwise circles, again focusing in on one area at a time. After going over the sides, you'll notice that this is more like a satin or a matte finish. If you want a higher polish, you can go to finer abrasive brushes, or you can take the bead just as it is now and put it in a tumbler with steel shot, a little bit of water, and a drop of Dawn for about half an hour. It'll get a really beautiful high finish on it just by tumbling it. Now your bead is complete. Experiment with the other hollow form shapes and the different variety of die-cut tools to create an endless assortment of beautiful beads. I hope you enjoyed this demonstration and see the possibilities of incorporating these tools into your own studio practice. I look forward to seeing what you'll create. Thanks for watching.